Savannah Brower had never been the kind of person to chase noise. Her entire adult life had been devoted to building calm where chaos had tried to take root. After 15 years of owning a successful custom deck and outdoor restoration business, she finally decided to step away from the constant pressure of clients, subcontractors, and delayed deliveries. It wasn't burnout, exactly. It was more like a quiet realization that life had to be more than just quotes, invoices, and warped cedar boards. When the chance came to buy a small home just off the slope of Ashwell Ridge, a neighborhood known for its older trees, wide lot properties, and carefully curated silence, Savannah didn't hesitate. The house wasn't perfect, and that's what she loved about it. It needed sanding, sealing, replacing, hands-on care. The lot it sat on was slightly overgrown, but in that rich, ancient way that whispered history. 3 towering elms stood like sentinels at the edge of the property, their branches filtering sunlight into fragments and dapples, cooling the western side of the house each evening. To Savannah, it felt like the trees were guardians, offering a kind of protection that wasn't about safety, but about balance. From the moment she moved in, she established a simple rhythm. Mornings began with coffee brewed strong and black, always on the back porch beneath the trees. She'd sit quietly, sometimes sketching in her notebook, sometimes not, listening to the sound of birds brushing past leaves, the distant hum of someone mowing 2 blocks away, and the occasional creak of the wind shifting the older branches above. Her. Savannah didn't socialize much in the neighborhood, and that had been intentional. After years of managing teams, vendors, and clients, she didn't want more names to remember or birthdays to track. She wanted space. It was a need, not a preference. People mistook that about her. She wasn't shy. She simply had no energy left for small talk that didn't mean anything. Her conversations now were with wood grain, clean angles, and seasons. Which is why, when Karen McCabe first introduced herself, Savannah instinctively kept the exchange minimal. Karen had shown up at the gate 3 days after Savannah moved in, dressed in beige capris and a lemon print blouse, the kind of outfit that screamed social structure in polite tones. She extended a bag of lemon muffins through the partially opened gate and said something along the lines of, "Welcome to Ashwell. We do hope you'll be active in the community." Savannah thanked her and closed the gate without stepping all the way outside. She never touched the muffins. Over the next few weeks, Karen made a point of inserting herself into Savannah's space in small, seemingly harmless ways. Once, she left a typed note in Savannah's mailbox, no envelope, mentioning that a few of us were wondering if you planned to repaint the shutters. They're slightly sun-bleached and could disrupt the visual harmony from the main road. Another time, Savannah came home from a supply run to find Karen standing at the edge of her lawn, shading her eyes with one hand and murmuring something about shade lines and moisture retention. But it wasn't until the 3rd unsolicited visit that Karen finally said the thing that would stick in Savannah's mind for days afterward. "You know," Karen said lightly, her manicured hand gesturing toward the trees, "a lot of us think those elms are a bit too dominant. They cast quite a long shadow in the afternoons. My pool barely gets direct sun after 3 p.m., and I'm sure you understand how problematic that is for maintaining proper water temperature." Savannah didn't reply immediately. She just stared at Karen for a long, still moment, long enough that Karen eventually looked away, adjusting the strap of her straw tote. "These trees have been here longer than either of us," Savannah finally said, her voice even. "They're not going anywhere." Karen smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, just thought I'd mention it." After that, Savannah began noticing things. Small, quiet things. Her garbage cans were moved a few inches forward on pickup days, just far enough to violate placement guidelines she'd never even read. A low humming noise, like a water pump or filtration unit, began vibrating faintly near her property line every night after sundown, ceasing precisely at midnight. The wind chimes she'd hung from the eave closest to the elms had been twisted strangely one morning, the metal petals bent at unnatural angles. These weren't crimes. These weren't even complaints. They were nudges, warnings dressed in civility, and Savannah knew better than to mistake them for coincidences. She'd met dozens of people like Karen in her life, people who ran organizations not for service, but for control. Karen didn't want safety. She wanted obedience disguised as aesthetic order. She wanted the world around her to reflect her version of peace. Trimmed hedges, no bikes in the driveway, no leaves left too long on the ground. She would never admit to the desire to dominate. It would always be framed as a communal expectation. So Savannah remained steady, but not passive. She began documenting things. Dates, sounds, small shifts. She installed a trail cam pointed not at her own property but at the strip of lawn along the border with Karen's. Not for surveillance, for facts. Not paranoia, just evidence. Still, she held off on any confrontation. Not because she was intimidated. She wasn't. But because she understood that battles with people like Karen weren't won by speeches or emotion. They were won by timing, by patience. The kind of patience that made others believe you weren't preparing anything at all. The kind of calm that made your opponent forget you might strike back. The real turning point came one humid afternoon in June, as Savannah sat in the shade of the elms, sketching out a concept for a new pergola design. She'd been so focused she hadn't noticed the subtle change in the air until it was too late. A sudden burst of buzzing, like chainsaws, and then the groan of wood, deep and guttural. She turned her head just in time to see the first elm tremble, listing slightly. Men in neon vests and hard hats moved with sharp efficiency along the tree line. One shouted to another to brace the trunk. Another was already feeding limbs into a chipper parked along the side road. Savannah shot to her feet and ran. By the time she reached the back fence, the first tree was already down. Karen stood on her upper deck, arms folded across her chest, watching silently. There were no warning signs, no permits displayed, no notifications. Just sawdust in the air and the hollow sound of something ancient and irreplaceable falling. Savannah didn't yell. She didn't cry. She walked back inside, closed the door gently behind her, and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking. Not about revenge, about consequence, precision, and pressure points. Because Savannah Brower didn't start fights, but she finished them. Savannah didn't sleep that night. Not even a little. She lay still in the dark, the window above her half open, letting in the scent of pulverized bark and gasoline, residues of the destruction that had taken place only hours earlier. The air was thick and still, as though even the wind had paused to process the violence done to the trees. The silence in her house was unnatural, not peaceful, the type of silence that presses against the ribs from the inside, heavy with things unsaid, things undone. She didn't pace or cry or scream. Savannah wasn't a woman who wasted time on gestures when there were things that could be done. She was methodical. But that didn't mean she wasn't burning. It was a deep fire. The kind that doesn't consume you in a flash but boils beneath the surface, heating every decision with purpose. At 6 a.m., just as the sky bled into its first thin gray, she was already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad in front of her and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. On the pad were 3 columns: action taken, names, and response. She had already listed the date and time the trees were cut, the number of workers present, their clothing, the make and license plate of the chipping truck, and the fact that none of them provided identification or paperwork when she confronted them. One of them had barely looked at her, mumbling that the lady from across the street said it was cleared. That was all he said before turning his back and finishing the job. Savannah hadn't stopped them. There were 4 of them. She wasn't stupid, but she had taken pictures. Not in a rush, but with care. Each fallen limb, the torn-up roots, the orange-painted trunk markings, even the loose bolts on the street barricade they never bothered to secure. By 8 o'clock, she was standing in the office of the city's urban forestry department, handing over a flash drive and printed photos to a young woman named Kayla, who looked like she hadn't had her second cup of coffee yet. Savannah spoke in clipped, factual statements. 3 mature elms removed without permit. No public notice, no arborist present. Contractor unidentified. Property owner not consulted. Kayla blinked a few times, clearly not used to residents showing up with full documentation first thing in the morning. She promised to escalate it and get back to Savannah within 48 hours. Savannah simply nodded and left. Next stop, her attorney, Marion Greer. Not a trial lawyer, not a celebrity type, but sharp in all the ways that mattered. Contract law, land use, nuisance ordinances. Savannah had hired her once before, when a supplier tried to double-charge her for lumber that had already been returned. Marion remembered her. Within an hour, Savannah had shared the photos, the sequence of events, and the names she'd overheard one of the workers mention. First names only, but enough for Marion to request a search for associated landscape licenses. Marion's expression never changed through the entire explanation. But when Savannah finished, the attorney simply said, "That woman just opened a very expensive door." The rest of the day moved like clockwork. Savannah filed a police report, not because she expected anything from it, but because paper trails mattered. She contacted her insurance company to report landscaping loss and had them send an adjuster that same week. She reached out to a friend who had worked with environmental consultants and asked if anyone could assess root system damage to the slope. If the wrong roots had been torn, there could be runoff issues, erosion, possibly structural shifting. Karen, in her obsession with afternoon sunlight, might have compromised the integrity of both their properties. That night, Savannah returned home to a strangely quiet street. The usual dog that barked 2 houses over was silent. The porch lights that dotted the neighborhood were dimmer than usual, or perhaps it just felt that way because the elms no longer shaded the space around her windows. Light poured in more directly now, harsh and yellow. The emptiness of the yard was disorienting, like standing in a theater after the curtain had fallen but the show had never really begun. She sat on the back steps for an hour, just staring at the raw stumps and the uneven earth where her trees once stood. They hadn't just been trees. They had been boundaries, barriers, walls without bricks, now gone, leaving her exposed in every direction. Karen didn't appear the next morning, nor the morning after. No knocks, no muffins, no remarks about community harmony. Just her pool, glistening across the street in the sun that now reached it unobstructed, like a prize snatched in the night. But something about the stillness felt wrong. It wasn't retreat, it was satisfaction. Savannah had seen that behavior before. People like Karen rarely gloat openly. They let their silence imply victory. They let others do the talking. Neighbors, whispers, policy sheets mailed in anonymous envelopes. And, just as Savannah expected, on the 3rd morning, a letter arrived. It wasn't formal. No seal, no city letterhead. Just a folded piece of paper placed in her mailbox with surgical precision. It read, "The removal was authorized under Section 11C of Community Lot Integrity Guidelines. Trees deemed overgrown or posing indirect impact to neighboring properties may be scheduled for corrective action following an observational consensus. The committee acted in the interest of shared property value. Please refrain from further escalation. No name, no signature, not even a return address." But the implication was clear. Savannah was supposed to accept what had happened as a decision made in her absence, justified by rules she'd never seen and would never be allowed to challenge directly. The language was meant to pacify, meant to make her feel as though she were the unreasonable one for reacting at all. She didn't respond, not with words. She returned to her list, she added a fourth column: structural leverage. She began researching the area's water flow maps. She pulled zoning permits for recent constructions, including Karen's recent pool and patio extensions. She requested drone imaging of the neighborhood's tree canopy pre-removal, which the city often kept on file for stormwater planning. She reached out to a land surveyor to verify setback boundaries, especially around shared grading lines between properties. Savannah wasn't planning retaliation. She was building a case, not for court, but for consequences. She wasn't interested in Karen being embarrassed or scolded or shamed in a community meeting. She was interested in systems: how water moved, how soil responded to voids, how long tiles could last when the ground beneath them started to shift. She was interested in evaporation rates, in sudden changes of humidity, in methods that didn't leave fingerprints, only effects. By the end of the week, she had booked an industrial-grade jet dryer under a construction rental account. Delivery was scheduled for the following Tuesday. No questions asked. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't post about it. She didn't leave any more notes, because Savannah Brower didn't argue about what was rightfully hers. She adjusted the environment. She made the imbalance felt. And she always waited for silence before setting her next move in motion. The jet dryer arrived in an unmarked white trailer hitched to a service truck driven by a man who didn't ask for ID or small talk. He backed it into the narrow strip of Savannah's side yard and handed her a clipboard with only 2 lines to initial. The machine itself looked more like a turbine than a dryer. Low, squat, made of metal scorched from heat exposure, with a power core humming faintly beneath steel casing. It was designed for industrial-grade floor drying after water damage, usually in warehouses or sub-level garages. Savannah had seen one in action before, years ago during a restoration job downtown, when a burst pipe had flooded the entire underfloor of a historic building. She knew what it could do. She also knew what it could do if used creatively. She kept it in storage for 2 nights, waiting. The forecast was clear, no chance of rain, which was critical. Savannah had mapped the airflow across her backyard in advance. The incline between her fence and Karen's yard, though slight, created a natural downward channel. All it needed was direction, focus, and time. Her fence already had a removable section near the tool shed, installed years ago by the previous owner for trailer access. That night, she pulled it open, just wide enough to position the nozzle on the dryer toward the lowest edge of Karen's yard, the stone retaining lip behind her patio, directly adjacent to the pool. Then she waited until 2 a.m., when the lights on Karen's deck had been off for over an hour and no dogs barked in any direction. The ignition was louder than Savannah preferred, but not enough to carry more than a property or 2. Once it was fully running, the dryer produced a concentrated jet of heated air with such focused velocity it flattened the grass and sent loose debris tumbling across the yard. Savannah monitored its positioning with a compact laser rangefinder, adjusting the pitch every 20 minutes to ensure maximum exposure along the curvature of the pool basin. Heat transfer took time, but with enough surface agitation, even ceramic and concrete gave way to stress. By sunrise, she shut it off, resealed the fence panel, and rolled the dryer back beneath the lean-to behind her shop. It had only been 6 hours, but the work was done. The following day, she didn't look out her window. She didn't walk near the street. She didn't peer through blinds or slow her steps. She went about her day as though nothing had changed. Around mid-morning, however, the sound of a raised voice filtered across the yard. Sharp, clipped, and unmistakably Karen's. Savannah could make out only fragments through the thick stucco of her kitchen walls. Tiles coming loose, and call someone now, and I don't care what it costs, fix it. By that afternoon, a service van with a Blue Pool Maintenance logo parked outside Karen's driveway. 2 men in work clothes unloaded tools and began inspecting the perimeter of the pool. Savannah didn't watch them. Instead, she sat at her dining table with a small notepad and began writing a list of every local contractor within a 20-mile radius who specialized in patio repair. She wasn't planning to call them. She was checking to see which names showed up on Karen's invoices later, because damage leaves a paper trail, and Savannah wanted that trail to run dry right when it mattered. 3 days later, another envelope appeared in her mailbox. This time it had a return address, but it wasn't from Karen directly. It was from a private mediation firm operating out of a shared office suite downtown. Inside was a single-page notice, politely worded but unmistakably loaded with intention. You, Karen McCabe, it read, was requesting formal review of ongoing neighborly disputes relating to excessive heat discharge and intentional landscaping malfunctions leading to cross-property impact. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't even a real claim. But it was a shot across the bow, wrapped in professional phrasing. A trap. Savannah didn't take the bait. She called Marion Greer and forwarded the document. Marion read it once, twice, then simply said, "This isn't legal positioning. This is intimidation. Ignore it. They're fishing." But Savannah knew better. People like Karen didn't fish unless they already had a hook in the water. The retaliation escalated in subtle, insidious ways. The next week, Savannah's water pressure dropped suddenly. A city inspector showed up at her door without an appointment, citing an anonymous report of unauthorized drainage systems. Savannah invited him in, calm and collected, and showed him every permit, pipe plan, and work authorization she had gathered weeks earlier. The inspector, clearly uncomfortable, nodded through most of it, muttered something about probably a mix-up, and left without writing a single note. 2 days after that, Savannah found her side gate unlatched and her garden hose turned on, flooding the corner bed near her rosemary plants. Nothing was stolen, nothing vandalized. Just water pooling where it wasn't supposed to. And yet, it told her everything. Karen hadn't just decided to escalate, she was testing how far Savannah would go to hold her ground, testing her silence, testing her limits. And Savannah held. But she also adapted. She rerouted her motion lights to cover every external path leading to her tools, gates, and fence line. She installed flood sensors beneath her crawl space in case of tampering. She rewired her shed lock with an internal magnetic latch, silent and far less breakable. She began working at odd hours, unpredictable ones, shifting her schedule just enough to disrupt any pattern someone might try to map. But more than that, she kept herself quiet. She didn't post online. She didn't mention Karen's name at the hardware store. She gave no one anything to repeat. Because pressure can be controlled, but perception had to be managed at the root. One afternoon, while checking her mail, she noticed a group of neighborhood women standing outside Karen's property. Mothers, mostly, and one elderly woman with a cane. They were clustered near the driveway, heads bowed toward something on the ground. Savannah approached slowly but didn't speak. When she came close enough, she saw the damage. The pool tiles had fractured outward in a sharp radial pattern, like a spiderweb of failed ceramic. Small, jagged shards littered the edge of the patio. A few of the women turned to her, their expressions hard to read, not accusing, not supportive, just hesitant. Karen emerged from her front door, voice sharp and brittle. "We're handling it," she said too loudly. "It's structural, nothing to do with landscaping. Cheap installation by the last contractor, that's all." But one of the women shook her head. "Karen, you said this was a premium build. Last year you told us it was engineered to hold double load." Karen's face twitched. "Well, I suppose I was misled." Savannah didn't stay long. She nodded politely and returned to her porch, where she sat for a while and just listened. Not to what was being said, but to how it was being said. Voices didn't carry the same way now. They cracked a little. People weren't so quick to agree. Doubt had found its way into the edges of the narrative. Later that night, Savannah stood near the place where her trees had once stood. The earth was still uneven there, soft and crumbly where roots had decayed. The stars overhead flickered coldly, indifferent to human struggles, and the air was still thick with the memory of sap and heat. She walked along the invisible line where shadow used to fall each afternoon, now swallowed by the pale spill of streetlights. And, for a moment, she felt something close to grief. Not for the trees. They had served their time. But for the idea that anything ever stayed untouched. She had not won. Not yet. But Karen had miscalculated. She had thought she was playing with a neighbor. She hadn't realized she was waking an architect. Not of buildings, of outcomes. And Savannah was far from done building. Savannah had never been someone who needed attention. She wasn't built for spectacle, didn't chase recognition, and didn't feel the need to defend her side of a story to people who weren't really listening. But there came a moment, subtle, like the weight shift in a collapsing structure, when she understood that silence wasn't neutrality anymore. It was permission. And Karen, despite her brief moment of retreat, had clearly begun testing how far permission would stretch. The damage to the pool had forced her off balance, but it hadn't stopped her. Instead, it had pushed her into a different gear, not louder, but deeper. Paperwork began to appear, notices of minor violations, new landscaping initiatives announced through unrequested newsletters, anonymous surveys that happened to include oddly specific questions about tree density, runoff patterns, and visual obstructions. One document referred to resident compliance with post-modification terrain stabilization, which Savannah recognized as a thinly veiled dig at the drainage slope adjustment she had completed 3 weeks earlier. They were provocations, not direct confrontations, but quiet attempts to reassert dominance through bureaucracy. Savannah responded by redirecting her focus. She no longer concerned herself with the passive-aggressive dances around her. Instead, she went after the foundation, literally. She contacted a soil and grading specialist and requested a formal survey of her entire backyard. It was expensive, detailed work involving drones, sensors, and days of measurement. When the results came back, they revealed what she had suspected. Karen's pool installation had disrupted the water table beneath the hill line. The removal of the trees had compounded the problem, and now, without their root systems to anchor the earth, a gradual slippage was forming along the rear edge of Karen's patio. Savannah didn't smile when she read the report. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt cold. This wasn't satisfaction, it was inevitability, unfolding exactly as nature dictated. She passed the report to Marion, who reviewed it, annotated it, and sent it along to a civil engineering consultant known for his precision and his lack of patience for unlicensed builds. Within a week, Savannah had on record a professional recommendation stating that recent landscape modifications, particularly hardscape additions, appear to have been completed without consideration for existing topographic limitations or established runoff patterns. Translated, Karen had built without accounting for slope or water flow, and Savannah, by documenting everything, had the pieces to prove it. But she still didn't strike, because Savannah wasn't playing to win an argument. She was preparing to collapse a framework, a legal, environmental, and reputational one. It was around this time that Savannah received an invitation, thinly disguised as a cordial request, to attend a community roundtable hosted at the house of one of the HOA board members. She was neither surprised nor interested. The meeting, however, was mentioned again in 2 different emails, one of which referred to clarifying neighborhood misunderstandings regarding property responsibilities. That was enough for Savannah to attend, not to plead her case, but to observe the players in their natural habitat. When she arrived, the room was already crowded. Folding chairs lined the perimeter of a brightly lit living room. Hors d'oeuvres sat untouched on an antique buffet table, and Karen stood near the fireplace, dressed in understated gray, flanked by two board members who looked like they had memorized Robert's Rules of Order in their sleep. As the meeting began, Karen didn't speak first. Instead, a man named Daniel, thin, wiry, always smiling just a little too much, introduced a document called the Visual Continuity Statement. He explained that recent events had highlighted the importance of maintaining not just property lines, but aesthetic cohesion, and that the board wished to gently formalize expectations to preserve harmony. Savannah remained still as Daniel went on, describing various bullet points that, while broad, all pointed in one direction: regulation of what could grow, what could be cut, and what could remain visible. Karen, finally stepping forward, described the removal of problem trees as an act of communal benefit, and noted the unfortunate damage to her pool as a consequence of irregular property alteration. It was a masterclass in reframing. She said nothing directly accusatory, but every word was a scalpel. When the floor opened for discussion, Savannah stood slowly, not commanding attention, but not hiding either. She asked one question. "Are there engineering assessments to back any of this?" Daniel blinked. Karen shifted slightly. One of the board members muttered, "Well, we trust our landscaping partners." Savannah nodded. Then she pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the coffee table. "This is an independent grading survey. It includes documentation of soil displacement, water channeling, and destabilization patterns, all of which began after unauthorized construction and vegetation removal. Any regulatory attempt to enforce guidelines that contribute to that kind of damage, especially without professional consultation, constitutes liability." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She handed over facts, and then she sat back down. The room was quiet, not hostile, just cracked open. After the meeting, 3 different people approached her. 2 couples and 1 single woman in her 60s who simply said, "They did something similar to me years ago. Took out a willow tree I'd raised from a sapling, claimed it was a root hazard. I didn't fight it then. I wish I had." That night, Savannah sat on her porch with her elbows on her knees, watching shadows move across her lawn where the elms used to stand. She felt something shift. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't isolation either. People had heard her. Not everyone, but enough. And Karen? Karen had felt it too. She didn't say a word on the way out of the meeting, just walked past Savannah with her shoulders a little stiffer, her steps just a bit too controlled. Savannah knew what was coming next. When people like Karen lose narrative control, they don't concede. They constrict, which meant the real fight was about to begin. And Savannah, for the first time, welcomed it. Karen didn't respond immediately after the community meeting. There were no sudden letters, no new violations posted to Savannah's mailbox, no committee updates bearing fine print laced with threat. In fact, the street seemed almost calm for a week. Too calm, in that way where the silence itself becomes loaded with implication. Savannah didn't trust it. She knew enough about structural tension to understand that what doesn't move on the surface is usually under pressure beneath it. And in neighborhoods like this, pressure wasn't released with shouting or direct confrontation. It manifested through paperwork, inspections, whispers, and traps buried in routine. The first signal came quietly. Savannah's business license, which she had held for nearly 16 years without issue, was flagged during its annual renewal for an address conflict. The office claimed her primary workspace, an attached garage she'd converted into a wood shop years prior, did not comply with local zoning limitations for light industrial use within a residential corridor. She wasn't fined. Not yet. Just placed under review, a status that temporarily froze her ability to purchase certain supplies wholesale and blocked her from accepting large-scale client orders through the system. It was surgical sabotage. Someone had submitted a zoning complaint and they had known exactly where to file it to create the most friction. Karen never signed her name to anything, but Savannah knew. It was her rhythm, her pattern, the indirect directness. Savannah didn't react outwardly. She hired a zoning consultant, submitted historical photos, blueprints, and grandfathered usage clauses that predated the updated codes. The review would take weeks, maybe months. It would cost her, but it would resolve in her favor. She was sure of that. In the meantime, she didn't sit idle. She adjusted her client schedule, shifted to mobile consults, and focused on design commissions that required less physical labor and more planning. She adapted, as she always had, but she noted the hit, logged it like a wound. The second blow came through her water bill. It quadrupled. Savannah stood in her kitchen staring at the envelope as if it might explain itself. She walked her property line, checked for leaks, surveyed every hose, valve, and irrigation sensor. Nothing. But a closer look at the meter readings showed usage spikes at irregular times. 3 in the morning, just before dawn, midday when she was never home. A plumber confirmed what she suspected. The spigot on the far side of her yard, barely visible from the road but accessible without triggering motion sensors, had been tampered with. Left open, slowly drained. It was petty, costly, and deliberate. She replaced the valve, added a lockable cover, and installed a hidden, pressure-triggered alarm on the pipe casing itself. Silent, internal, and only notifying her. It wasn't about the money. It was about erosion. The slow, methodical kind that doesn't break you all at once, but chips away at your footing until you slip just enough to fall. Savannah knew the tactic. She'd seen it used in negotiations, in business, in politics. Karen wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. She was trying to outlast her, starve her out emotionally, financially, socially, turn the neighborhood into a quiet field of pressure. But what Karen hadn't realized was that Savannah didn't bend under pressure. She refined under it. The shift came with the next move. An unexpected escalation not against Savannah directly, but around her. Several of the neighbors who had shown her support after the meeting began receiving letters themselves. Suggestions that their garden walls violated visibility protocols, that their tree branches overhung into sidewalks dangerously, that their porch lights were non-compliant with updated fixture guidelines. The letters didn't accuse. They inquired. Politely, but always with the same subtext. You're not as compliant as you think you are. One of them, a woman named Helen who had told Savannah about the willow tree that had once stood behind her porch, came over one morning, visibly shaken. She held the letter in one hand and a cup of tea in the other, as if trying to steady herself with warmth. "She's doing it again," Helen said. "She's making people think they're wrong for existing." Savannah didn't tell her what to do. She didn't offer legal advice. She just listened. And in that quiet, something solidified. Something beyond retaliation or defense. Karen wasn't just trying to control a property line. She was trying to rewrite the terms of being allowed to live in peace. Savannah called Marion and requested that the report from the engineering consultant be reviewed by a state-level environmental compliance officer. She framed it not as a neighbor dispute but as a possible watershed disruption with long-term implications for shared terrain. The compliance office didn't move quickly, but it moved officially. When they reached out for a site survey, Savannah provided access and remained calm as the officer took photographs, samples, and notes on the soil, the slope, and the cracked patio visible beyond Karen's fence. She never mentioned names, never offered theories. She didn't need to. The earth was already speaking. The day after the inspection, Savannah received a visit. It wasn't hostile. In fact, it was almost surreal. Karen herself, standing at the edge of Savannah's driveway, holding a large envelope and wearing a pleasant, practiced smile. She didn't approach fully, just hovered near the front walk and called out, "I thought we might reset." "I've got some proposals here," landscaping ideas that could be mutually beneficial. Savannah stepped outside but said nothing. Karen continued. I understand things got misunderstood, but we can fix this, you know. I think you'll find my suggestions very reasonable. Savannah took the envelope but didn't open it. She looked Karen in the eye, not with challenge or threat, but with the steadiness of someone who had outgrown the need to explain herself. I don't need landscaping suggestions, she said. I need you to stop pretending this is about trees. Karen's smile twitched. I'm trying to be diplomatic. You don't get to destroy something and then negotiate over the ashes. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was tired. Karen didn't respond. She just gave a slight nod, turned, and walked away. Not defeated. Not even angry, just calculating. Savannah recognized that look. It was the look of someone reassessing a strategy. The next week, Karen's patio was cordoned off with red tape. Officially, it was a preventative safety measure, pending inspection of load-bearing substrate beneath the tiles. Unofficially, it was the result of a city order to assess structural integrity after the compliance visit. The tape wasn't dramatic, just 2 neat lines stretched between metal posts, but in this neighborhood, it was as loud as a siren. Savannah didn't gloat. She didn't smile when she passed it. She didn't tell anyone. She planted 2 new trees. Not elms, those needed decades, but quick-rooting red maples chosen for their density, their vertical growth pattern, and the way their leaves flared crimson in the fall. She planted them in silence, alone, working the soil with slow, deliberate care. She didn't tell anyone their names, but she gave them names in her head. The next morning, a rock appeared at the base of one. Not thrown, placed. Small, smooth, with a single word etched into it by hand. Stand. No note, no signature. Savannah didn't move it. She just let it stay, like a flag planted quietly in soil that had already chosen a side. The air on the ridge began to shift, not with the seasons, but with the way people walked past each other. There was a stiffness now, subtle at first, like the difference between greeting a stranger and acknowledging someone you're silently keeping tabs on. The tension wasn't open, but it was unmistakable. Neighbors who used to wave now paused, measuring their glances, watching for cues before deciding which direction a sidewalk conversation might go. Karen's patio remained taped off, the stone tiles beneath it turning a pale, brittle hue under the sun, exposed and cracked in patterns that mirrored the once carefully orchestrated order of her influence. Where she had once commanded conversations with subtle direction and social currency, she now sat slightly outside the circles she had spent years shaping, her words no longer carrying quite the same implied authority. Savannah kept to her rhythm. She wasn't waiting for approval, wasn't looking for allies, but even silence has a sound, and she could hear the way people were starting to listen differently. It showed in the way Helen lingered longer at the mailbox, in the way a teenager from 3 houses down offered to help carry a bag of soil without prompting, in the way no one, not one person, ever asked what had happened to the pool. They knew, maybe not the full story, but they knew enough to know it hadn't been weather or age or accident. Something deliberate had taken place, and it had changed the ground beneath everyone's feet, not just structurally, but socially. Karen's next move was both predictable and clumsy. A petition circulated, digitally of course, neat and impersonal, calling for the formation of a neutral beautification committee tasked with enforcing positive aesthetic standards in response to recent declines in visual coherence. It was dressed in language that sounded agreeable at first glance, but Savannah recognized the bones of it immediately. It wasn't about beauty. It was about control, a way to rebuild the power Karen had lost, to reinstall herself as the gatekeeper without having to name her intentions. The petition gained initial support from those who either didn't read closely or feared appearing indifferent to community standards, but it faltered within days. Too many residents had begun asking the wrong questions. Questions about who would oversee the committee, how guidelines would be defined, whether this was related to recent conflicts. The momentum Karen had hoped for collapsed under the weight of vague motives. The real break came quietly, not through confrontation, but through exposure. An email thread, one Karen had mistakenly copied to a broader list than intended, revealed her direct involvement in the zoning complaint that had temporarily jeopardized Savannah's business license. The message wasn't overtly malicious, but it was clear enough. Phrasing like, flagging her usage under the home-based clause might at least buy us time, and, at the very least, it'll keep her distracted from causing more trouble. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they stripped away the pretense. There was no community concern, no aesthetic integrity, just strategic harassment. The thread spread, slowly at first, then quickly moving from inbox to inbox, passed discreetly but thoroughly. No one forwarded it to Savannah directly, but by the time Marion mentioned it during a call, she had already read it 3 times. The moment wasn't triumphant. It was clarifying. A private truth becoming public fact, undeniable and irreversible. Karen had crossed a line she couldn't erase with charm or muffins or carefully curated charm. She wasn't the voice of standards anymore. She was a liability. Shortly after, a meeting was called, not by Karen, but by 3 other residents who had previously remained neutral. It was held at the park down the road, under the shade of an old elm Savannah remembered from her first walk through the neighborhood. The meeting wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, just a quiet consensus forming around a single idea. Boundaries must be respected. Property, yes, but also dignity. Agency, the right to exist in one space without constant undermining. No votes were taken, no resolutions passed. But in neighborhoods like this, sometimes the absence of support is louder than any formal decision. Karen, who attended out of pride or habit or both, left early, her polite smile barely holding its shape. Within a week, the red tape around her patio was joined by orange warning tags, marking the beginning of required corrective measures. The city had deemed the slope beneath the patio unstable enough to require foundation reinforcement, which meant excavation, which meant noise, disruption, and, worst of all, visibility. Contractors came and went. Dirt piled up. Machinery roared. And the people who had once admired her curated landscaping now stepped around cones and detour signs to avoid the mess. Savannah never said a word. She simply kept watering her new trees, watching their leaves stretch upward, listening to the way the wind moved around her house now. Freer, more honest. She adjusted her workshop schedule, finalized new client contracts, and slowly began incorporating more native flora into her yard, inviting birds and bees back into a space once muted by ornamental sterility. Her property became something alive, not just arranged. One morning, while sweeping her porch, she noticed Karen standing across the street, staring. Not glaring, not performing, just looking. No clipboard, no phone in hand, no words. Just stillness. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before she turned and walked away, not hurried, not defiant. And in that brief glance, Savannah saw the weight that comes when control slips too far out of reach to be recovered. There was no satisfaction in it, just finality. Whatever Karen had been building, her authority, her influence, her facade, it had cracked. Not all at once, and not from a single strike, but through the quiet, relentless pressure of someone who refused to be moved. And as the morning sun caught the tips of the young maples rising on Savannah's lawn, a gust of wind moved through their branches with a sound like breath. Months passed. The air grew cooler, and the ridge settled into that strange quiet that comes between seasons, when the wind seems to forget which direction it's supposed to move, and the trees, even the young ones, hold their breath. Savannah's maples took root quickly. Their leaves turned early, Deep red, almost bruised in color like something once restrained had finally begun to express itself without filter. She didn't name the season. She didn't mark the anniversary of the first tree falling, but she knew it was around this time last year when everything had started, and her body carried the memory in the way she noticed light, shadows, the slight dampness of morning earth. Karen's property, once the anchor of the street's curated tone, had changed. Not dramatically, not in ways an outsider would notice, but in the small shifts, the grass growing unevenly along the back fence line, the shrubs trimmed hastily rather than sculpted, the pool now empty, not drained with ceremony but left to dry, its surface clouded over by a residue of algae and dust that had settled without permission. No one spoke of it anymore. Not in meetings, not in conversation, not even in whispers. It was as though the street had collectively agreed to pretend the pool had never been there, or that its presence had never mattered. The silence around it was not forgetfulness. It was distancing. Savannah resumed her life without commentary. She reopened her business account, returned to her old supplier network, and filled her workshop with long, low music that flowed through open windows. Clients returned, orders picked up. But more than that, something in her posture shifted. Less guarded, less angled. She no longer watched the street from behind curtains or waited for the sound of another confrontation brewing beneath the surface. The pressure that had shaped her days for months had receded. Not all at once, but in the way a tide pulls back after a storm. Reluctant, but certain. It was not peace in the traditional sense. It was something closer to equilibrium. One afternoon, Helen walked over with a cutting from her garden. Rosemary, bundled neatly in twine. She didn't say much, just handed it over and remarked, "I thought you might like the scent near your shop." They stood in silence for a moment before Helen added, "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You reminded the rest of us how to." Savannah didn't reply, just accepted the herbs with a nod. They both knew the conversation wasn't about plants. Later that week, a moving truck appeared outside Karen's house. No announcement, no sign, no sale listing ever posted. Just a slow, methodical emptying of boxes and furniture. No neighbors stood outside to observe. No one came to offer help or say goodbye. By the time the sun set, the driveway was clear and the windows stood bare. The porch light, once always on past midnight, remained dark. Savannah stood by her front door, one hand resting against the frame, and watched the stillness settle. There was no satisfaction in the departure, no moment of triumph, just banality. The kind that doesn't need to be declared to be felt. She didn't wave, she didn't nod. She simply remained, grounded, as Karen's car turned the corner and disappeared. The next morning, Savannah walked to the base of her youngest tree and found the stone still there, the one with the word "stand" etched into it.